In addition to God creating a spectrum of perfection of activity and uniqueness, God also created a spectrum of perfection of intelligence in at least some of the animals of the world. In the next two sessions, we'll look at examples of these things, and in the first session, we'll talk about intelligence as seen in instinctive versus learned behavior. So we need to define those terms. Instinctive behavior can be defined as that activity of animals that an animal does the correct way 100% of the time, the first time they do it. So it's as if the behavior has been programmed. They don't need to learn it. They know it instinctively, perfectly the first time. For example, when you look at honeybees, when they start out a single cell. They start out in an egg. The egg is laid in a cell. The cell is, in addition to the egg, the bee will put in some food with the egg and then cap the cell. The tiny little larvae, which looks kind of like a maggot, will break out of the egg, eat the food, and grow into an adult bee inside that cell. Then comes time for it to eat its way out of the cap, the wax cap on the top. When it comes out, it automatically starts working, taking care of other bees that are developing inside the cell. It looks around for cells that are open, where other bees have come out, and it'll lick those cells clean, preparing them for the next egg. It also will take food that it develops in actually its forehead, scraping off that food and putting it into the cell with the eggs so that the cells will be able to, so that the little baby bees will be able to develop. And then when the queen has laid the egg and they have put the food in the cell, they will then produce wax, which they produce on their underside, and cap the cell. And they do that automatically. They don't need to be taught how to take care of other baby bees in that first few days of its existence. And then at a certain point, they will turn from nursing, that's what we call that behavior, to beginning to look for pollen and nectar in flowers. No one teaches them how to do this. That's an example of instinctive behavior. You have also another example of instinctive behavior is a bird that has food in its mouth, and as soon as it sees a little baby bird with an open mouth, they just automatically stick the food in that mouth. And it results in some interesting observations. There's a YouTube video, for example, that shows a swan floating in a little pond, eating food that's in a tray beside the pond. The swan is picking up the food. There's some goldfish in the pond that have come up out of the water, their mouths out of the water with their mouths open, and the swan can't help but put some of the food into the mouth of the open goldfish, the open mouths of the goldfish. So the swan eats some stuff and then puts it into the mouth of the goldfish. It can't help but do it. It's something that's instinctive. It's something they automatically do. Another example is the birthing of puppies. At one point, my daughter insisted on getting a dog, and I finally agreed to do that. I gave her the specifications of what kind of a dog was acceptable. She went out and she and her mother found a dog and brought it back home. Little did we know that the dog that she chose turned out to be a female. Even though she was extremely young, she was in fact pregnant. And so very soon after we got her, a couple months later, we realized she is going to give birth to puppies. But she still herself was just a puppy. And I was a little concerned that she wouldn't know what to do in that process of giving birth. And so that night when she did give birth, I was there to watch the process. And it was an amazing thing to watch. I didn't have to help her one bit because she seemed instinctively to know exactly what to do. As each puppy was birthed in a sack, she would reach in and she'd bare her teeth like she was going to eat the little baby, but she would break through the sac with those canine teeth without hurting the baby, ripping the sac open, pulling the baby out, licking the baby until it's clean, pushing or nudging the baby towards her own nipples, and then she would eat the sac that the baby was in. Then she'd go to the next baby as it was birthed. She knew exactly what to do in exactly the right sequence, even though no mommy had taught her to do this, and she had never seen the birth of another dog to in fact know how to do it. So this is an example of instinctive behavior. Those behaviors that are done perfectly the very first time they're done, we call those things examples of instinctive behavior. In opposition to that, we have behavior that organisms have to learn. It takes them multiple tries to finally get it right. And this is, of course, called learned behavior. The simplest form of learned behavior is something called habituation. This is where an organism's normal response to particular things that happen is overridden by the animal getting used to the phenomenon. Classic examples here would be the pigeons in the city. Normally, pigeons, as wild pigeons, they would be a little skittish around people. If there was a person that came up too close, the pigeon would fly. If there's a lot of people around, the pigeons wouldn't alight in that area. They wouldn't stay in a place with a lot of people. But pigeons that live in cities get used to people. They get habituated to people. So they aren't so inclined to fly away when a person gets close. So they override their natural, let's say, instinct, which is to fly away, and they learn that it's okay to stay there. And in fact, if they stay there and perform just right, maybe people will feed them, and there's an advantage to doing so. So this is an example of habituation. Another example would be organisms that live near an airport. Now, the sound of a plane taking off or landing is usually far greater than the kind of sound that animals can tolerate. But animals that live near an airport get used to the sound. So rather than running or hiding, they might actually go about their business like nothing had ever happened. And a great example of this in my own experience was a train wreck that occurred when I was a child in the town about 7 miles from where I lived. My father was a photographer for the newspaper, so he is called out to take photographs at one such train wreck derailment in town, and he took me along with. So I was there as we took pictures of the entire train and everything that was going on. At one point, it's interesting, somebody said, "Where is so-and-so?" There was a name of an individual that was given. This is a person who lived in a house between two railroad tracks. The railroad tracks were only about 50 feet apart, so this was a tiny little house very close to each railroad track on each side, and realized that his house was right in the middle of this pile of railroad cars. Like, where on earth is this guy? Where's his house? And it turns out when they went to where they knew his house was, that there was a train car that had rolled over on one side of the house, so you couldn't see the house from that side. Another train car had rolled over on the other side of the house, so you couldn't see that side of the house. Another train car had ended up on its top on the third side of the house, and another railroad car apparently had flipped over and taken off the top of the house, the roof of the house. And so the roof of the house was actually on the fourth side. And when they got into the house, they realized that the guy was still asleep on his bed with no roof above his bed. This train wreck had occurred. The roof had been torn off the top of his house, and he'd slept right through it because he had become habituated to the sounds of trains. 120 trains went through that town every day. And he was so used to that sound that even a train wreck didn't even wake him up. That would be an example of habituation on the part of humans. A second type of learned behavior is called imprinting. This is where an organism's behavior, how it behaves, is dependent on experiences that it had when it was younger. Usually it's the first thing that an animal sees when it is birthed, or the first thing a bird sees when it hatches from an egg. Very often, the very first thing that a bird sees when it hatches, it believes is its mother, and it will follow that organism. Even if it isn't their mother that they see the first time, they will imprint upon that organism that was the first one they see, and will follow that organism around, learn to eat by watching that organism, will hopefully be fed by that organism. And in fact, if they never encounter another organism of their same species, because sometimes that first thing they see isn't their own species, they might actually try to mate with the same species as the animal was that they first saw. Classic examples of this are, several films have been made of several instances where Canada geese have been raised from eggs. So they didn't see their parents. For whatever reason, their parents were hurt or killed or whatever. And so the baby geese, when they hatched from their eggs, the first thing they saw were the humans that in fact took care of them. And so there will tend to be, in those cases, that those geese will follow along behind the humans. They will try to behave like humans. They will try to learn to eat like humans do. So those that are being followed had better kind of modify their behavior to help the geese learn how to walk. And they will tend not to fly because humans don't fly. So there's some great examples of situations where Canada geese have been raised in this fashion, and they will tend not to fly unless humans can figure out how to fly. So one instance that a film was made from, a little girl was imprinted upon by the Canada geese. When it came time for them to be old enough to fly south for the winter, her father designed for her a little plane that she could fly in. And she could get that plane going, and her geese that would follow her flew after her and followed her. And she led them to a place where the geese gathered to go south, and she was able then to train them to leave her and follow the geese. Examples of imprinting are really very interesting. We have another type of learned behavior called conditioning. This is where perhaps a little more sophisticated than either imprinting or habituation. This is where an organism learns a sequence of events, a sequence of actions, a sequence of things that they have to do to get either a product that they want or, in fact, to get something they don't want. They realize that if they followed a particular path of events, that they would get something. They want to follow that path. If they get punished for it, they will avoid that path. Classic examples, an experimenter with the last name of Pavlov experimenting with dogs is well known to have caused his dogs to salivate when they heard a bell. Because what he began doing is he would ring a bell and then feed the dogs. He'd ring a bell, feed the dogs. And this occurred for a very long period of time. So there got to be that when he rang the bell, even if he hadn't brought out the food yet, the dogs would begin to salivate. They'd begin to, I'm hungry. They'd begin to react as if they're about to get fed food. This is an example of conditioning, where the dogs have come to believe or come to associate food with, in that case, a sound. There's other instances where organisms, let's say you've got a frog that eats insects, but he happens upon one day a type of insect that actually doesn't taste very good. Once the frog has found something that doesn't taste good, he spits it out, and he will tend not to, if he ever sees that kind of insect again, he'll tend not to try to eat that insect. He remembers, he's conditioned to understand that that insect doesn't taste good at all. Examples of conditioning would include organisms that have been trained to make their way through mazes. Organisms that realize if they turn right and then turn left and go up here and do this or press this lever, they'll get food. They actually remember that sequence and they will follow or learn how to follow that sequence in order to get the food at the end. There are a number of organisms that can do this. Rats can be conditioned to follow mazes. Crows can be conditioned to do various things in a particular sequence to find the food at the end. Flatworms even can be trained, at least in the simple mazes. Goldfish, ants, octopi, all of these kinds of organisms have been trained to go through various complexities of mazes to get food at the end. Another type of learned behavior is what we call mental mapping. An organism actually memorizes its surroundings, its environment, and thus learns how to get around in that environment. For example, if you take a hive of bees and close the hive up and move it a long distance, shake it up so the hive knows that it's being moved, as soon as you open the hive back up in the new location, the bees will leave the hive and begin circling the hive. They realize the hive has been moved. They are circling it and memorizing the position of nearby objects in the position of the hive. They go outward further and further, memorizing a map, if you wish, of the local area. So when they go out from the hive and come back, they know their way back to the hive. This is also what many of the animals in the zoo that you might see pacing back and forth, many of those organisms do that when they first get into a new enclosure. They will go along the entire perimeter of the cage, of the enclosure, and memorize the position of everything in the enclosure, so they know how to get around in that enclosure. So they create sort of a memory of their environment so that they can locomote within it. Another type of behavior in this category is what we call imitative behavior. This is where an organism imitates the behavior, apes the behavior, copies the behavior of another organism. It might be their own kind, or it might be another organism's behavior. For example, little baby chicks, they learn how to eat by watching their parents. So their parents have a tendency to scare up little insects by what we call scratching. They shuffle on the ground and scratch in such a way as to scare up insects that they can then peck and eat. The little baby chicks will follow along behind mother by imprinting and then watch the mother as she scratches. They will learn to scratch in the same fashion. So they're imitating their mother and thus learn how to eat in that fashion. Raccoons learn to forage by imitating their parents. And this is evident to me when I was a kid growing up. We had opportunity to raise a number of organisms. We lived out in the woods, and we'd occasionally find abandoned baby animals of various species, and we would take them in, raise them, re-release them into the wild when those organisms were either well or at least big enough to release into the wild. And one type of organism that we repeatedly raised was the raccoon. It wasn't every year, but many springs we would be going through the woods with the snow still on the ground, and we'd hear some crying of some animal. We'd find our way to the sound, and we'd find a little baby raccoon, very small, usually kicked out of its nest even before its eyes were able to be and were open, in the midst of the snow there, didn't know where they were. They couldn't get back to the nest. They were crying. They would never be accepted back into the nest under those circumstances. So we'd pick the little fellers up, take them home, and raise them. We had opportunity usually to raise them for the duration of the season, throughout the rest of the spring, the summer, and into the fall. And somewhere around the mid-fall, they would get the call of the wild, and they would be called out into the woods, and they would only naturally go back into the woods to live a normal life. But we had them for those couple months period of time, and raccoons were extraordinary. They were fun organisms to have as not really pets, because they're not going to be long-term. We only had them for a short time. We had opportunity once to babysit, coon sit, I guess it's raccoon sit, for a baby raccoon that was in the possession of someone who lived in town. I don't remember how those folks got the raccoon in the first place, but they kept the little guy in a bird cage hanging in the basement, and they fed the raccoon dog food through the cage walls. The coon was never outside, never learned, what I feared is never learned how to be a raccoon, how to live as a raccoon under normal circumstances. But we had opportunity to coon sit that baby raccoon, named Bobby, over one weekend. And I determined that, being afraid that this coon would never learn how to live in the wild unless we taught it how to live in the wild, because that's how raccoons learn, I determined to show the raccoon how to eat. And so on the Saturday of that weekend, I took little Bobby and I went down to the creek. Bobby followed me all the way to the creek. He was okay with that. He was a little guy, so he was pretty tired by the time we got to the creek. But when we got to the creek, he'd never seen a creek before. This is a place raccoons love, but he didn't know anything about creeks. I picked him up, threw him in the water. And the little guy, the kind of a typical raccoon reaction, whenever they're surprised by something or angry at something, they will jump back, and he jumped out of the water, and they'll arch their back and they'll hiss. And he was hissing at the water because the water had done something to him. He didn't understand this phenomenon of getting wet, or whatever the case may be. And as soon as he got out of the water in that fashion, I threw him back in the water, and he jumped back out of the water and hissed. He wasn't quite as far away from the water at that point. He was on the edge of the water. I then got myself into the water, and he was on the bank. He didn't want to have anything to do with the water, at least initially. But then I splashed him. Well, he hissed at the splashing, but then he came a little bit closer to the water, and then I splashed him again, and he hissed and backed up, and then he got even closer to the edge of the water, and I splashed him, and he didn't go back quite as far. He hissed, but then he came right up to the water and stuck his hand in the water and sort of flipped his hand up a little bit, so a little bit of water kind of came up there. And then I splashed him, and he backed up, and then this time he put his hand in and flicked his hand and threw up a little water about 3 or 4 inches. Didn't go very far. But I splashed him again. He then got further in so that he had his front legs in the water, and then he used his arm to splash about halfway to me. Then I splashed him again. He backed up. He went a little further into the water, splashed this time, and almost made it to me. Then I splashed him again, and he threw himself into the water, and this time he got me, and we then had a splashing fight, going back and forth. He was imitating my behavior, and in this fashion, I was going to teach him, I was hoping, how to eat. So the next thing I did is, while he's splashing with one hand, that's a cool thing about raccoons, and it's a rule about raccoons, you got to know. Raccoons do 3 things at the same time, but these 3 things have to be done separately. They can't be done together. So there's one thing that's done with the right hand, there's something that's done with the left hand, and then the eyes will look in a different place. A raccoon never looks at whatever they're doing. So they look very innocent. You know, you put them on your shoulder. There's one hand that's going down the back of your shirt, checking out the back of your shirt. There's another hand that's checking out your eye. And then they're looking out in the sky like, I'm not doing that. And so this is what he's splashing with one hand. I know And he's not looking, of course. I'm splashing. I'm not doing that. And I know there's another hand which isn't doing anything. So I reach underneath the water through the gravel, and I grab onto his hand a little bit. He pulls his hand back. He continues to be splash with the other hand, but he pulls that hand back and gradually puts it back in. I grab onto it again. He pulls it back, and this time when he puts it in, while he's still splashing with the other hand, they're quite ambidextrous, he reaches out and he's searching through the water to find my hand to do the same thing. Again, he's imitating my behavior. But at one point, he stops and he picks something up, probably a rock from the bottom of the creek, and stuffs it into his mouth. And then he promptly spits it out. And then he does some more searching for my hand, and then he finds something else. He pops it in his mouth and spits that one out. The third time he threw something in his mouth, I heard this crunch, and I saw his eyes go, woo. That must have tasted good, because all of a sudden he gets very excited. He forgot about splashing me. He forgot about reaching for me. He starts now searching through the rocks at the bottom of the stream, every once in a while picking up at first rocks, spitting them out. Then he was picking up snails. They'd crunch, and his eyes would get excited, and then he was off and running. He knew how to find snails in the water. In that fashion, he learned how to eat, how to forage. And that's how mother raccoons teach baby raccoons to forage. They will simply go out, show the babies how to break down a corn plant and get to the corn, or how to get into the chicken house and get access to the eggs, whatever the case may be. Little baby raccoons learn by imitating their parents, by aping their parents. Porpoises that are used in SeaWorld, for example, are trained to go through a series of stunts. Well, another porpoise can actually watch the activities or the show of another porpoise and imitate it and learn to do exactly the same things just by watching. And this is imitative behavior that is very common for certain species, like the porpoises. Parrots will imitate words that are made by humans. Of course, they don't naturally speak human words, but if they hear human words, they are very good mimickers or apers of sounds, and they can imitate human voices. A friend of mine had a gray parrot, very good at copying sounds, and I was staying at his apartment once. The only individuals in the apartment were myself, a gray parrot, and a Chihuahua dog. My friend was out, I don't know what he was doing, shopping or something, so I was alone in the apartment. And then I heard the phone ring. As I was looking around for the phone, I was also thinking, I wonder whether I should answer the phone. It's not my phone, it's my friend's phone, so I wasn't sure when I found it, if I should pick it up. But it took me a while, because it kept ring, and then it rang a second time. Finally, I found the phone. The reason I was having trouble finding it was the sound actually wasn't coming from the phone. When I got to the phone, it wasn't ringing. And as soon as I got to the phone and was trying to figure out why the phone wasn't making any sound, I then heard, "Hello." And there's a pause. "Yes, they're not home." "Nope, I don't think so. Goodbye." Click. The parrot had mimicked or aped one half of a telephone conversation. The parrot had mimicked the sound of the ringing phone, had mimicked the answer to the phone by probably my friend, and had remembered or mimicked a couple of phrases, and then even clicked the phone down with the sound that would be made by a clicking phone. Parrots are great examples of imitators or mimics of behavior of other organisms. Now, a lot of these examples of imitative behavior would be beneficial to the organism. For example, for a raccoon to imitate the behavior of its parents in eating brings benefit to the baby raccoon because they learn how to eat. But other activities, mimicking activities, are not beneficial or necessarily beneficial to the animal, and suggests that organisms are capable of even more sophisticated behavior than imitative behavior that's necessary. For example, there's one parrot who not only mimicked words, but actually mimicked gestures as well. What's interesting about these examples, by the way, there are some capabilities that seem to be that an entire species of organism seems to have. And there are other more sophisticated behaviors that not every individual in the species is capable of having, but only some, as if there are smarter individuals in species of animals. And this is the case here. Not all parrots do what I'm about to describe, but occasionally there's a parrot that comes along, probably a smarter parrot, I guess, who not only can mimic words and sounds, but mimic gestures as well. So there's a parrot that, while it's saying chow, it would actually raise a foot and wave at the same time that it's saying chow. When it says forget it, it would actually toss something and grab onto something with its foot and toss it to the side. Forget it, and giving both a gesture and a sound for a given action. Saying whoops, drop the peanut, while bending over as if to pick up the peanut. Remember, Lloyd Morgan, don't forget, while using claw motions on the last two words. Remember, Morgan, don't forget. The same kind of actions that probably the owner of the parrot, in fact, used with the words. One bottlenose dolphin used a feather to scrape the lining of its tank in one of the SeaWorld exhibits because what that dolphin had seen repeatedly is a human diver coming and scraping, cleaning the side of the tank. And the dolphin was simulating the activity of that diver by scraping the edge of the tank with, in this case, a seagull feather. One bottlenose dolphin was known to mimic every single organism that swam in its tank. So it would swim like a seal, which swims differently than a dolphin. And then it would turn to swimming like a turtle, which again swims in a very different way than either the seal or the dolphin. Or it would imitate the actions of skates or penguins in its cage. Some orangutans have been known to mimic humans in using a toothbrush. Pick up a toothbrush and brush their teeth just like humans. They're just watching. They're just imitating or aping, in that case, the humans. One orang, Sapina, even ignited a fire with kerosene. So it took kerosene, put it on some sticks, ignited the fire with a sparker, and then picked up a trash can lid and waved it there to get the fire going. Obviously something that Sapina had seen humans do. So we have a number of examples of behavior that's everything from instinctive behavior to learned behavior, from simple learned behaviors to more complicated learned behaviors. So we have a spectrum of perfection of behaviors that point us to the possibility of something with very sophisticated learned behaviors. We'll continue with this, some other examples of this sort of thing in the next section.